to advance his interests amid the war on terror. I suppose it's one of the great ironies of the time that to the extent OIF was intended to prevent Saddam from distracting us from the fight against terrorists, the invasion of Iraq eventually led us to becoming enmeshed in what many would argue is the major diversion from our principal conflict. I don't think it was ever clear to anyone at CIA when the decision to go to war occurred. I have to agree with George Tenet's comments in his memoir. Those of us supporting the U.S. military, such as myself, had a sense fairly early as we saw CENTCOM's war plan develop that war was likely inevitable. Analysts following Saddam's weapons program or his alleged links to al-Qaeda appear to have come to this conclusion much later. As I mentioned earlier, most of us shared the impression that the issue of should we go to war had already been decided by the summer of 2002, and thus it seemed natural to focus on how. In the trenches then, most generally assumed the war was going to occur barring some unlikely set of circumstances resulting in Saddam's demise or the Iraqis' capitulation. There were differing opinions, of course, about the wisdom of this, but as professionals we continue to do our work. Also, and this was touched upon earlier, it was easy enough to rationalize the prospect of war as an effort to enforce international law because of Iraq's violations of UN Security Council resolutions and the 1991 ceasefire agreement. In addition, because of the concern I mentioned earlier about the cost of our sanctions policy to the Iraqi people, viewing future military operations in part as a needed humanitarian intervention only seemed natural. In fact, many of my fellow Iraqi analysts had spent years supporting the U.S. government as its efforts to indict Iraqi officials for the various crimes against humanity and in tracking and documenting the terror and even the ecological devastation that Saddam inflicted on his country. In my opinion, these views and subsequent public statements by U.S. officials in support of applying the Bush Doctrine to Iraq intended to conflate the issue of humanitarian intervention and preventive and preemptive war. It did not make for a particularly clear picture of the moral situation other than, for many of us, it just seemed right to put an end to Saddam's regime. And again, at CIA, we worked very hard and diligently to provide the best analysis we could to enable our government and our military to do this. Okay. Despite all this, it was only later that we began to understand that perhaps intelligence had not played its full role. In its ideal conception, intelligence, or more accurately, strategic intelligence, is the fusion of information from a variety of clandestine and open sources, and its analysis is packaged to help our leaders form policy regarding war and peace. As Sherman Kent explained during the CIA's early years, it is or should be the, quote, knowledge required for decision and action. Its job is to see that the doers are well informed. Its job is to stand behind them with the book open to the right page. But it seems to me that in the run-up to Operation Iraqi Freedom, as much as we tried to keep the policymakers well informed, some were not interested in looking at the right page. This was especially true if that page held information that differed from their preferred view. In the time I have, I cannot, nor do I have a desire to go over the various fights between the intelligence community and other parts of the government over the analysis of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, Iraq al-Qaeda links, the reliability of reporting from Iraqi expatriates affiliated with Ahmed Chalabi, and other issues where, quote, unhelpful, unquote, analysis was ignored or undermined. I personally believe there was culpability on all sides for what some would characterize as the misuse of intelligence analysis, as well as for the analytic flaws by the intelligence community that led to mistaken assessments on the status of Iraq's WMD programs and other matters. For the discussion at hand on preventive war, however, I think it's worth saying that in retrospect, it is clear that intelligence was not used to make the most important national security decisions regarding war, and instead was relegated primarily for use supporting the public case for military force. I say this in large part because the President's key advisors on issues of war and peace have stated publicly that they were never asked if they thought it was a good idea to go to war. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld in his recent memoir wrote that he was never asked, and because none of the principals ever stated opposition, assumed that all agreed. CI Director Tenet also says that he was never asked, and according to Bob Woodward, he allegedly told an aide that he thought going to war was wrong. Neither man, nor anyone else apparently, thought to offer their opinions to the Commander-in-Chief. Frankly, that thought still amazes me. I can only imagine what the conversation might have been had the principal leaders of the United States, perhaps including senior leaders from Capitol Hill, had gone over what American strategic intelligence had to say about any of the applicable just war or legalist paradigm criteria, especially with regard to preventive war. At a minimum, I think there would have been much more discussion about the actual risks Saddam's Iraq posed to its neighbors, U.S. allies, and the United States. And again, as sort of has been discussed previously, there's that issue of capabilities versus intentions, which is always the hard part of the work we do at the intelligence community. We're actually pretty good on a lot of the capability stuff. It's the intentions that get you. And that's where the greatest uncertainty is. With such deliberations, there possibly would have been a move away from the technical discussions about what weapons Saddam might have to a more thorough consideration of the Iraqis' intentions and the ability to use them. While there was a plausible case, as Robert Jervis has written, to be made about active and growing WMD programs in Iraq, there would have been much more difficulty, I believe, in making anything more than a highly speculative case for Saddam being able to sustain any type of serious threat to a neighbor's territorial integrity or sovereignty. Another one of the ironies of the period was pointed out by an in-house CIA study led by former Deputy Director Richard Kerr. He noted in a study that although the administration regularly ignored what he called human factor analyses that were closer to the mark regarding Iraqi intentions and likely post-war developments, it was the more technical analysis of products, such as the flawed Iraq WMD estimate, that was more readily embraced. I don't presume to know how such dedicated discussions might have turned out, but I think that in examining more closely the assessments relevant to the risk and uncertainty surrounding the issue, they might have created a case for better war planning and for preparations for some of the post-war challenges we faced. Actually, although it may appear odd to some, CIA has some practice with this approach. Former DCI William Colby in 1989 wrote that the standards for selecting covert actions that are just could be developed by analogy with just war doctrines. And since the early 1990s, the CIA Covert Action Review Group has explored questions regarding proposed covert actions that are consistent with just war theory. Former Director Judge William Webster noted in 1991 that the review group explored whether a proposed covert action was consistent with our laws and American values and made sense to the American people. As one CIA officer has written, these standards were easily reformulated to coincide with just war criteria. Indeed, based on my experience overseeing covert action programs while serving on the National Security Council, it appears that the decision to go to war received much less consideration and review than what was normally applied to the preparation and signing of a presidential finding necessary to conduct a covert action program. And again, I'm distinguishing between the decision to take the action versus all of the work that went into deciding how to take the action. I'll finish with one last thought. Secretary of Defense Gates, in a speech at West Point in April of 2008, reminded the cadets that war is, by its nature, unpredictable and uncontrollable. He insisted, and I agree, that the Bush doctrine of preemption is legitimate. But, former CIA analyst that he is, Secretary Gates wondered out loud, quote, how high must the threshold of confidence in our intelligence have to be to justify at home and abroad a preemptive or preemptive war? Secretary Gates did not answer his question, and I think that's because the question isn't answerable. As I said at the beginning, the context matters. The answer will need to be developed on a case-by-case basis. To ensure that such deliberations in the future are done well and adequately justify the preventive or preemptive use of force, however, I can only hope that future U.S. political and military leaders maintain a strong policymaker-intelligence relationship. This relationship needs to be honest and needs to be based on a goodwill that tolerates disagreements and holds to recognized standards of analytic discipline and critical thinking. For all our flaws, I've been impressed during my years at CIA and as a member of the larger intelligence community by the seriousness with which analysts hold to their professional values, particularly regarding analytic objectivity and integrity. They take their oath seriously, and while some fail to always uphold the standard, the vast majority strives mightily to do their job well and to provide the best and most objective analysis possible. In short, to meet increased thresholds of confidence, this high level of objectivity is what we have to continue to seek. And while analysts understand that policymakers have a different role, all have to adhere to standards in assessing information. Ideology and dogma have to be put aside for the national interest. And in terms of moral issues, the foundation of determining whether the criteria for preventive war have been met must include a common understanding of the moral requirement for honesty, particularly in analyzing and interpreting vague, incomplete, and uncertain intelligence information. The stakes for our country and for the fate of beneficial international rule of law are much too high to do otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Our third speaker and discussant for the day is Joe Wood. Joe is a member of the Marshall Fund, where he's been since 2008 as a senior resident fellow. Prior to that, he served as a Deputy Assistant to the Vice President for National Security Affairs beginning in 2005, responsible for United States policy focused on Europe, Eurasia, and Africa. He is retired Air Force Colonel with assignments including operational and command of fighter wings in Korea and Europe, faculty member at the United States Air Force Academy, as well as senior position in the Office of the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, as well as the Joint Staff, U.S. Mission to the Conventional Forces in Europe negotiations in Vienna, Office of Secretary of Defense, as well as SHAPE headquarters in Mons, Belgium. Though again, the most important thing you know about Joe is a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy, proving that we have accomplished jointness. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Jeff. And to the first two presenters, it's an honor to be here. It's a beautiful place. Naval Academy is a fantastic venue for talking about and thinking about these kinds of things. I have to say, I walked around a little bit earlier today, and we've got West Point at the Air Force Academy, we have Annapolis. They're widely different geographic situations, but they all have a certain common feeling to them. And I tell you, there's 30-year-old instincts that can't be repressed. I was walking around, seeing the place, and I was suddenly seized with horror that my shoes are not polished. I've been worried about that in a long, long time, but it comes right back. I negotiated for myself the role of respondent today. I did that for a couple of reasons. One is I have no large published body of work on this issue or these sets of issues, so I'd rather listen to people who have thought very carefully about them. I hope I've thought carefully about them, but not maybe in the professional and rigorous way that many of you have and you've been charged to do. So I got myself the job of respondent, which also suits me because I'm basically a lazy person, and being respondent is absolutely the heart of sloth. You have no work to do other than listen to the other folks and react to them. I want to go through both the presentations, or at least a few key points that we just heard, and raise some questions and some points, and then maybe offer a few conclusions of my own. I had a different perspective than Steve's in 2002, 2003. I was still on active duty in the Air Force, and I was working on European issues almost exclusively. But at that time frame, everything we did with Europe had to do with Iraq or Afghanistan. And so I had some interest and involvement in the decisions that were made. And then I went back in 2005, 2008, when the disaster in Iraq at that point was playing out before it turned back up after the surge. So I have a little different perspective than Steve had from the analytical world. And again, a non-academic perspective as well. More of a policy practitioner perspective that I'll try to give you in reaction to the thoughts that we've heard so far. Dr. Rodin talks about the strong moral reasons and presumption, I guess, against prevention. And he begins with what I think is the absolute foundational point, which is that in all of these discussions, I believe the unit of analysis, both for the moral considerations and for the consequence or utilitarian considerations, should be the individual human person. I think the state is secondary to that, and that the morality that we derive about just war and about decision-making to engage in military action has to begin with considerations of what is right, just for the individual person, and secondarily and by derivation, what is right for the state to accomplish. He talks about, Dr. Dunn talked about war sometimes justified on utilitarian grounds and yet opposed on consequentialist grounds. I want to come back to that because I think it's a very useful distinction, but it also points the other way, I think. And he argues that you can only attack others, again, please correct me, by the way, don't hesitate if I'm misstating what you stated. You can only attack others if they are guilty or liable as individuals of engaging in either the conspiracy that he developed or an actual military act that is somehow otherwise would justify military response. It seems to me that operationally, when you're looking at this from a policy perspective and a decision of whether to actually take military action, that is fundamentally a question of discrimination between non-combatants and combatants. And it is thus freighted with all the same difficult questions that you face on whether or not a target is legitimate when you're talking about just in bello just war theory, as well as